All right, what is going on, everybody? Welcome back to another day of SaberSim's DFS Office Hours. It is Wednesday, February 2nd of 2022, 22 today, which is kind of fun here. Every time I start this show and I go on and I do my introduction, I say the date and I say what day of the week it is here. I always have to, for just a split second, I start doubting myself. And I think, man, if I get the day of the week wrong on this stream, it is going to be so embarrassing. But it is indeed Wednesday today here. We've got 9 games of basketball here on tap for tonight. Another hockey slate. We've got a few questions in the queue here for today. So welcome, everybody. We'll go ahead and jump in here in just a minute. As always, if this is your first time watching the show, or just as a reminder, if you've got questions for me, go ahead and pop them into the Office Hours channel in Slack or into the YouTube chat. And we'll answer questions here in roughly the order they come in. I typically start with the questions that came in Slack before the stream, and then we slowly work our way over to the questions coming in YouTube chat. So if you haven't picked up on it already, or if you are new to the stream here, the best way to get your question answered earlier in the stream is to put it into the Office Hours channel in Slack. The easiest way to do that is to be a part of the Slack community, and the link to join the Slack community is in the description of every past Office Hours video. So if you're coming on here, you're ready to ask your question, and you're wondering why it takes me a half hour or 45 minutes or so to get to it, it's because we got a lot of questions in the queue in Slack. So that is the best place to go if you want your question answered early. But as always, totally fine to ask your questions wherever it's convenient to you. But anyway, enough about all of that. Let's go ahead and get into things here. Again, just going to kind of pick things up from right where we left off yesterday. So this question came in from DFS Toolkit here about exposure editing in late swap. So he said, question, how do you change exposures in late swap? So let's talk about that here. I'm going to jump over to DraftKings because I at least have some entries reserved for the slate tonight here. And we'll talk about it. So let's get this going. The main thing, while I'm kind of working through this here, the main thing that's unique about the late swap exposures is that you have to, you do most of your exposure editing when you're late swapping before the build as opposed to after it. That's the main difference here. So let's go ahead. We got to start. We got to get some lineups in here first. So let's go ahead and get a build going for tonight's slate. About time I do my first build of the day and kind of see how things are looking for tonight anyway. But let's get this going. And I'll kind of do a full, I guess, a full demo here real quickly of you know how the exposures all work with late swap here. So when you run your actual build, right, you do a lot of your exposure editing after the lineups are made. And the reason that this works is because instead of just building 20, we're building 500, right? So when you go in here and say, no way am I playing 100% Cedi Osman here, right? You can knock that down to 70%. No way am I playing 75% Marquise Chris here. Interesting names popping today, but definitely well-projected plays there, right? You've got your exposure settings here. You click save. Right. So again, what's happening here is we're sorting through the 20. We're sorting through the pool of 500 to find the 20 that match best here. Right. So we've got our lineup set. We're all good here. We go back over to the entries tab here. And when we fill these, we will match the exposures. Right. So we're actually getting a little bit more Cedi Osman here because I'm filling with rank. So there's like a disproportionate amount of Cedi. And the same thing with Chris, right? Those guys are appearing more heavily in our higher lineups. So they're showing up more often than the max exposures here. But they came over, right? This 70 and 40 here. And these will be persistent. This has changed. In the past, you know, if you late swapped consistently throughout the night, these would start to go away. These will now be persistent as long as you're kind of sticking with the same original entries file you were working with all night. But from here, right, when we late swap, we're only going to late swap. Well, actually, first, let's download. So from here, when we go to late swap, we're only actually going to swap the number of unique lineups that we have. So we have 20 unique lineups, so we're only going to do 20 lineups. And there's not going to be a pool of lineups around this. We're just building the 20. So that means you can't set exposures after the late swap because there's no pool of lineups to sort through to match the exposures. So if you want to add additional exposures here, you need to do it in the entry editor here, right? So, maybe, throughout the slate, I don't know, maybe something happens and you think that there's maybe a leverage opportunity and you're going through and you want to make sure. I don't even know who's playing in the late game, so I'm just going to make something up. But, let's say for some reason that you decide that you want to get some exposure to Embiid as the slate goes on. And again, I don't know who he's playing. Maybe it's the first game on the slate, but just as a hypothetical example, and you kind of decide that you want to get 20% exposure to Embiid in this next swap that you're going to be doing, right? And maybe you're keeping the other exposures. So we've set that here in the entry editor here, right? 20%. And now when we go to swap, we'll do this. And this will honor our swaps, or not our swaps. It will honor our exposures. So we can see here, we've gotten 25% Embiid. If we check on Chris, we have 40% max Chris. If we check on SETI, we have 70% max SETI. If we download this from this screen, right? We click download, we click save file. We're giving a signal to SaberSim that we're using this set of lineups, right? And then we go back to entries. We'll see that it now understands, okay, that guy downloaded the lineups. Those are now the lineups in his contests. We're all good here. We are still persisting the exposures. So like you can kind of track this throughout the night and make sure that things are ending up where you want them to be. So that is, in a nutshell, how you do that. Let's keep going. All right. Question from JSJR. Similar theme to a lot of questions we've been talking about this week, I guess. Should we be aiming for players with single-digit ownership? If not, what would you recommend the percentage of ownership be we should roster or pivot to a different player? Also, how many positions would you recommend that someone should pivot to a lower-owned player? Yeah, so very similar themes to a lot of what we've been talking about this week. There's been a lot of questions about how much ownership should I have on a total lineup level? How much ownership is appropriate on a given player? How much over or under the field should I be on a particular player relative to their ownership? So I'm going to answer this question the exact same way I've answered all of these questions this week and say that this is slate dependent and this is contest dependent. So there isn't an answer that I can just give. I can't tell you should have 2 players under 5% owned in all of your lineups, or you should have 1 player under 5% owned in all of your lineups, or that for a player that is 20% owned, your leverage on that player should be 60%, right? And in fact, I'll even go one step further and tell you that anybody that is giving you that kind of DFS advice is not helping you. Those kinds of heuristics are backwards. The reason they are backwards is they are taking tools that are the only way traditional optimizers have to deal with ownership and writing their own DFS strategies about how to play DFS. In other words, the reason that you even hear these things, right? How much total lineup ownership sum should I have? How many players should I force into my lineups that are less than 5% owned? Is because these are the only tools that other optimizers have to deal with the problem of ownership, right? If you hop onto Fantasy Cruncher, right, and say, okay, I want to make sure I'm not playing the stone chalk. How can you do that? Well, it is by setting a rule saying force this number of players under a certain total lineup ownership into my lineups, or first force my total cumulative lineup ownership under this certain value, right? And it's backwards because that's not thinking about, what is the optimal approach to dealing with ownership. That's thinking of what are the tools that other traditional optimizers give me to dealing with ownership, and then how do I build a strategy around that, right? And it doesn't take into account the fact that, on a larger field contest with a top heavier payout structure, maybe you need to get more variant. Maybe you need to fade ownership more heavily, versus on a smaller single entry, you don't need to fade it as much. It's not taking into account the fact that last night, when we have the entire Warrior starting lineup is sitting practically, and all of the Warrior starters are projected for like at least 7 or 8x, that you could build viable lineups with 4 40% owned Warrior players in them, right? Doesn't account for that kind of thing. So I've kind of answered this question in a similar flavor throughout the week, but I'm going to kind of like up the I don't know, the I don't even want to say intensity, but I guess it is like up. This is really, really not the right way to think about it, right? These are rules that have been created to make other optimizers frankly, more inferior optimizers deal with ownership at all. And it doesn't, you don't really need to think about that here in terms of setting those kinds of rules, right? So, and let me explain why again, and then I'll leave this question with, a couple ways to maybe take this a step further and add some value, right? So what is ownership fade doing, right? This is the most sophisticated approach to dealing with the problem of ownership in DFS that exists in an optimizer, right? This is taking in it naturally partners with sim variance, right? So what it is doing is it is taking from a given set of simulations, right? It'll take the players' projections that they score in that set of sims, right? It will compare how variant that player is, how wide their range of outcomes are across their entire set of simulations, and then look at the ownership projection of that particular player and make a determination on whether or not that player makes sense to use in that lineup, given the projections they scored in that set of sims and their ownership projection, right? So it's basically kind of side by side comparing the variance of a player and their ownership projection to make a determination on a per player basis, right? I mean, compare that to something like set a rule that doesn't allow you to roster any player over 30% owned, or force one player under 5% in all of your lineups, right? Like, you can kind of see the difference here because we're relying on the simulations to help determine if a player should be rostered at their ownership. It is inherently taking into account the slate context, right? So that's like the one thing, right? The reason I don't like these rule of thumbs and heuristics with ownership, right? There are two reasons. One is it doesn't take into account slate context, right? Since this directly pulls into the simulation data into making this determination, it takes into account slate context. Number two, right? The second reason I don't like these ownership heuristics is because they don't take into account contest context, right? Well, how do we deal with that problem? We adjust our ownership fade slider based on the contest you tell us you're playing, right? We turn down the impact of ownership when you're playing a 5,000 person single entry. We turn up the ownership factor when you're playing a 50,000 person 150 max, right? So that's kind of how we solve those two problems. So, I guess the kind of the thing I would leave you with here is, I think there's still a couple ways to add value to the process if you kind of want to get an ownership edge. One of those ways, and again, this is something that I do more in NFL, MLB, other sports, is to experiment with the research builds, right? This is a way that I have come up with as a way to add additional value to the process from an ownership standpoint, right? This is essentially why I like running research builds. And getting to the point of the year where there's not really a lot of contests, not really a lot of sport types where I might do it. But, maybe something, might experiment with it for the Super Bowl when, we don't have ownership projections yet, but where ownership fade might be kind of important, right? You run these builds, you compare how often a player shows up in the optimal versus their ownership projection, and then make a determination beyond just what you're getting from the ownership fade in there, right? Another great way to add value, I think, to the ownership fade model is to look at the ownership projections yourself and to cross-check those, right? You may cross-check them against another source. You may cross-check them against your own intuition. If you're unsure how to build intuition of what ownership might look like for your particular contests, the best way to do it is to study the actual ownership percentages from the contest you are playing in, right? I've gained a sense of kind of intuitive ownership projecting, or I can kind of get a sense of where I think things feel a little off, because every single night in NBA, I look and see, how did we project ownership and how is the ownership actually falling? But a great way to make your ownership approach on a slate more sharp is to make sure that the inputs to that system, the ownership projections themselves, are as accurate as possible. So if you can get a sense of where ownership is going to fall, right, that's a great way to approach that. So, but there are a variety of ways to kind of, I think, add value to the way we handle ownership at SaberSim, but it is not by kind of, I would say it's not by forcing in less sophisticated systems of dealing with ownership onto our process, right? Like you would find at other optimizers. So, but John says, okay, so we should put players into our roster with high upside. That should be with what we are concerned with in our construction of the rosters. Yeah, it's like high upside at an ownership that is appropriate for that player, right? Like last night we had, if we just go back to last night and look at some of these high projected Warriors plays, right? Now, not all of them paid off, right? You have certain situations that come up. We got a little bit of a different. First of all, we got a different starting lineup for the Warriors than was expected, right? But then secondly to that, we got, Gary Payton had like insane foul trouble, so kind of some things outside of our control, right? But I mean, you could have cranked up, Jordan Poole's ownership projection to probably like 60, 70, 80% and cranked up your ownership fade and still gotten a ton of that player, right? Because he possessed so much upside, or Moses Moody, right? Maybe that's even a better example, right? Like you could have cranked up the ownership projections on some of these guys and just still gotten so much of them because their potential upside or output in a small subsection of the Sims outweighed virtually any ownership fade, right? It was almost never appropriate to fade that player if you just experimented with this, right? With very high ownership projections and very high ownership fade, right? So it's yes. I mean, you want to be seeking out higher owned plays, or the builder is seeking out, it's not higher owned. The builder is seeking out higher upside plays. But it's all kind of compared relatively to the ownership of that player. So if I can like put you down kind of a path of thinking about this, is I would say whatever your individual process kind of ends up being with adding additional value to ownership, right? I would think about it less from the rules that you are trying to put in, right? Less from the standpoint of like, I force this rule or lineup construction in every time for this sport and slate size or something like that. I would think more on the kind of the theory of what you are trying to do. And what you are trying to do is say, in a nutshell, essentially, does the player's percent chance of being in the winning lineup for this contest, is that more or less than their projected ownership in the contest, right? Now, there's I think some other ways to take that, but I think that's ultimately kind of the ownership fade question, right? Does Jokic have greater than a 22% chance of appearing in the winning lineup tonight? Well, then I would want to be, if he does, yes, I would want to be overweight on him, right? Assuming this number's right. That's where the updating ownership projections kind of has value. So anyway, I'm going to move on for now. But I guess it was good maybe that I spent a little bit more time on that today because it's been a popular question this week here. So, but let's keep it going for now. And there was a question from Andrew about withdrawing questions or withdrawing Yahoo entries. I just learned this based on Epic Problems answer. And apparently you can't bulk withdraw on Yahoo even through their support, which is kind of, I whenever I have to do a ton of withdrawals on a site, I just email support because it's easier. Apparently Yahoo won't let you do that. So if you're interested, there's a screenshot from Epic Problem in Slack about where that cancel contest entry is. But anyway, I found that odd and surprised that Yahoo won't cancel your lineups bulk like that. But anyway, let's go ahead. Let's keep it going and answer this question from Epic Problem here about the differences between sites. He says, specifically for NBA at least, my profit curves for DK versus FanDuel remain comically different from another. About 1/3 of my daily investment is in DK, always within contest selection guidelines. 2/3 is in FanDuel. I've never really had anything resembling a sweat on DK. Usually lucky to break even and have bricked several slates. On FanDuel, I've been doing pretty well. At worst, usually recoup quite a lot of my entry fees, even when I stray into slightly higher stakes. I'm trying to decide how to interpret this. Is it simply the sharpness between the two sites on full display, reaching top 1% on DK 1% of the time, but more like 2% of the time on FanDuel? Is there a fathomable process consideration between the two sites? I see sometimes people with the exact opposite complaint. They do well on DK, but not FanDuel. At first glance, it would seem my DK investment would be better allocated at FanDuel, but it certainly feels like targeting the softer contests at DK would be yielding a better result than putting more entries beyond the $3 fan line at FanDuel. I think almost certainly this difference is best explained by just pure variance, right? I will call back to a video of mine here right? This one. I'm sure you guys know where I'm going with this. This video, right, where I simulated out 100 slates. You can see, again, if you go back and watch this video, every single time I do that slate sim, we bounce from a negative, slightly negative season, essentially, to a very positive season, to a more negative season, to a break-even season, to a slightly positive season, right? I think probably what's likely here is that there's just variance between your results, right? You're basically just getting kind of one, like, what we are essentially doing by playing out a full season on FanDuel and a full season on DraftKings is you're basically just getting kind of one refresh of this sim each time. And I think it's likely that you're just experiencing the variance between doing this on two different sites. The one thing to note here is that your results on one site, in actuality, your results on DraftKings and your results on FanDuel are not going to be completely independent from each other, right? They're going to be somewhat correlated to one another. But I think they're not as correlated as people might necessarily think because of the differences in roster construction and salaries, right? So I think this just sounds like pure variance to me. I think it's also it's justified as well by the fact that, and you're right, I often see people from where I sit on this asking me a similar question with the exact opposite viewpoint, right? They're like, I'm crushing DK, I suck at FanDuel. Is DK easier? What's going on? Why is this different? Should I just play on DK? Look, I think the answer to this question is, it gets interesting with the contest selection mix, but if you just prefer FanDuel, there's nothing wrong with playing there more, right? Even if it's a situation that will just maybe alleviate some tilt, right? That is nothing wrong with just sticking to one site. In fact, it makes it quite a bit easier to manage, especially for NBA when you're late swapping and managing lock and things like that. If you are capped out on soft contests on FanDuel, right? For example, you're playing all of the great contests that are under that $3 range already, and you need to get additional action down, and that is why you are playing DK, then I would probably say your money is still best left in the softer contests on DK, right? Because there's actually a competitive advantage that you are getting by getting softer action on DK, and you're probably just having kind of poor variance on the difference between your results. But if you were just playing two sites just to do it, right? There's been times in my DFS career where I've been playing up to 4 different sites, and there wasn't really ever a good reason for it. I was just doing it just so I had different lineups in play, and I guess maybe just so I could check different sites throughout the night, right? That especially if it is kind of leading to some tilt because of the difference in results, isn't really worth it. And might as well just jump over to the one site. So again, I think what's probably most likely happening here is that you're probably just kind of experiencing quite a bit of variance between the two sites, right? Kind of just some randomness here. It's also right here, you said you're reaching top 1% on DK 1% of the time and more like 2% on FanDuel, right? We're talking about a point, right? A single, we're talking about a single percentage point of difference here, even in your top 1% equity, even amongst what is, if you've been playing every single slate since the start of the season, still in the long term, a relatively small sample size, right? So difficult for me to say that this is anything other than randomness or pure variance here, right? I think in some ways, again, that FanDuel might play slightly softer than DraftKings because they have smaller prize pools, so they attract in general a softer field. They have softer pricing, which again is going to, in general, benefit the sharper players, right? When there are more, I think this is a common misconception in DFS, but the more free squares there are, the more extremely well-projected plays there are, the more skill expression it allows, right? The sharper pricing is on a slate, the harder it is to express skill, generally speaking, right? Because there's just more randomness in the results. So I think FanDuel can play slightly softer overall than DraftKings, but it is not something that I would think would lead to a significant difference in results. If it did, if there was one site that we felt that was had an extreme competitive advantage over the other, we would just tell you to play there. And I don't think that's the case. And actually, let me put it differently. The market would ultimately kind of decide if there was one site that had a significant competitive advantage, right? if the average player's expectation was to perform twice as well on FanDuel than DraftKings, right, you would see the market kind of deal with that problem and then also eventually solve that problem, right? In other words, you would see an influx of players to that particular site, and then also a rebalancing as the overall skill level of that site adjusted, it would kind of balance back out. So actually, just from like and this is kind of a tangent. I'll say this and then we'll wrap this question up. But if there was one site where there was an extremely much better competitive advantage for certain players than the other, it would not last very long, because in a essentially like a financial market that we have here, right, the sharpest players are going to find that edge and basically use it until it's destroyed, because they've brought the overall skill level of the site up too high, right? So for that reason alone, I think that is like a strong enough reason to know that there's not such a big difference in the sites like this. Not really, not beyond the variance of what you're actually experiencing in your results. So anyway, enough ranting on that one. Let's move on here. And quick question here from HC. And he said, how many players from the same team do you normally play in your lineup? I don't worry about it, to be honest. Right. I think I let the kind of combination of whatever correlation we're using for that particular contest plus the individual sims to kind of help me determine what logical lineup constructions look like. Right. Like last night, I had a ton of lineups that had 4 warriors. I think I had some that had 5. And I had also plenty that had 3 or 2 or 1 or whatever. Right. On a slate like tonight, probably won't get that. Maybe you get some like Cleveland value. Maybe you get a few lineups that have more exposure to Cleveland players. I know Max and I know, I've heard from other sharp players, they like to go in and set this rule that says no more than 3 players from the same team, and even maybe be selective on what teams you allow for that. I think to me, it feels mostly like busy work, because you know that you are getting you are getting lineups that are optimal for a set of sims. And so there's a set of game outcomes where that roster construction makes sense. So to me, it kind of resolves that problem for you. The argument would be, well, how can 3 or 4 or 5 players from the same team all have a ceiling outcome or all be optimal in the lineup? And from my perspective, the simulations answer that question for you. Well, you are only going to get lineups with that particular construction in line with the rate at which they are optimal for subsets of simulations. That's my take. Again, I think this is one that's probably a little bit more contentious, because I know sharp players like to set this rule that says no more than. So, I mean, I guess if you wanted a rule to set here, I know this is popular, no more than 3 players from the same team, right? And again, I don't see any problem with that. I don't think it's going to degrade the value of your lineups at all. I just feel like combined with what we already have in the correlation slider and leveraging the sims themselves, you are going to get lineups that make sense regardless, in terms of number of players per team, right? But I mean, I'm curious. So we have no 4 stacks tonight anyway. Looks like in this first test build I did, we did get a couple Orlando 3 stacks. So, I mean, here's another approach, right? Another approach would be do your test, just like we say for other things here, do your test build, see what you're getting by default, right? Are you getting large stacks? Is it a slate where there are 4 or 5 stacks that are at all viable anyway, right? And if they are, or even 3 stacks, right? Take a look at the teams that are being used there, right? And then ask yourself, maybe you come back to this. Do I even want Orlando 3 stacks, right? It's a little strange that I got 3 of them, right? Maybe it gives you a path to research here. Let's go see like what does Orlando look like? What does this game environment look like, right? Okay, so we have a team that is basically across the board projected for over 5x, right? Pretty well projected team, but no one over 6x, playing in a game that at least right now we project to be a pretty good scoring environment, right? I think, people's intuition, or at least my intuition as a basketball fan, is never that the Pacers play at such a fast pace and have such high total games. But this season they really have, which is why every time they're on the slate, it seems like their game environment lends itself well to stacking, right? But maybe this is a situation where you say, yeah, this looks like a team where a couple guys could be optimal, but I think it's unlikely that you get 3, right? So then maybe you set a rule in that case, or maybe you come back to your build right? And take advantage of our new filters. And say, maybe you do something like this. Maybe you say, show me all lineups that have, oh, that's interesting. I think the projections reset on me, but maybe you say, show me all lineups that have an Orlando 3 stack and don't have who's playing for Indy? LeVert. So any lineups that have the Orlando 3 stack that don't have Karis LeVert, and delete them. Wait. Delete them from the entire pool. Right? Maybe do something like that. So now we have one Orlando 3 stack, but it has LeVert in it. So we're basically stacked up the game, right? You do something like that too. So anyway, all of this to say, I think the Sims kind of account for this in a way that feels natural to me. I think going through the process of even setting a rule just feels kind of unnecessary. It feels like busy work for me. If you want to look into this, because I think this is something that, I at least know that other players do. I would say start with the test build and see how the slate's breaking out overall, right? Like, is it the kind of slate where 4 stacks are viable? Is it the kind of slate where a lot of 3 stacks are viable? And then figure out what you want to do on a per team or a per stack size basis before kind of just using a blind rule. That would be my recommendation. So, okay, cool. And then interesting question here from Larson. Should be a good one. So this question says, how should we best avoid the duplicate lineups that the sim spits out? Meaning if we all put in a 3-max sim and leave all of the sliders the same, won't we all get the same top 3 lineups? And if we put duplicate lineups, if we put that into 3-max contests, won't we get a bunch of duplicate lineups that share the payout? Brand new user to Saber, and I'm not exactly sure how to differentiate specifically in NBA, where I see more duplicate lineups than I was seeing in NFL. I have kept an earlier sim run on some builds to differentiate to the most recent sims. If it creates dupes, that might be outdone by a previous run of the Sims. Okay. This sent into the streaming software out of order, but I get the spirit of what is being asked here for. So first of all, you are not going to get the same 3 lineups as other SaberSim users, even if you build lineups with the same set of projections and the same sliders as other users. And in fact, I think that's one of I think that is one of the most amazing things about SaberSim and one of the things that is most representative of the failures of other optimizers, right? If you use the same projections and the same settings and everything else on like a different tool and have no randomness applied, right? The builder will give you the same 3 lineups at the top. And it is basically, saying with too much confidence that these are the best 3 lineups you can play, right? This is one of the problems of traditional optimizers. The actual pool of viable lineups for even a smaller field contest is far larger than they would indicate, right? You won't get the same identical lineups on SaberSim as other users necessarily, right? And we can even test this, right? Let's run a couple builds. The reason why you won't is because of the sim variance slider. So each time you build a lineup, right? Not a build. Each time you have every single individual lineup, based on where your sim variance slider is set, we are going to randomly sample our full set of simulations for the game and use a random subset of sims that corresponds to that particular lineup, right? And we have approximately 10,000 simulations for each game, and we're bucketing them randomly each time you build a lineup. The odds of you, even amongst your own builds, recreating the exact same set of sims that were used to build one lineup in another is very, very low, right? So if we do this, right, and I was experimenting with this before the start of the stream, you can actually just test this out, right? You can run multiple kind of repeated builds and compare the lineups that you are getting out of them. Now, overall, because we're using the same set of projections, right, you're often probably going to find that the builder is going to like the same players. It's going to have a similar angle on the slate. But your raw chance of just having a lineup be just straight up duplicated amongst multiple builds is actually pretty low, right? So you can see, I'll take a screenshot of this lineup here real quick, just so I can kind of track it. Let me pull this over here. Okay, so I've got that screenshot, and then let's run another 3 max here, right? And see. And the risk of having a duplication between multiple, builds or even different SaberSim users is not zero, right? There's not a 0% chance of this happening, right? But it is not as likely as I think people think, right? So this original lineup we built was, Levert, Clarkson, Osman, Wendell Carter were the first 4 players, right? Now you can see like here's a lineup that has 3 of those guys in there, right? And it actually has Clarkson in the utility guard spot, but it has Luka. Our original lineup didn't have Luka, right? I know you guys can't see the original lineup, but I'm kind of comparing them side by side. The same players are liked by the Sims overall, right? But the chance of being duplicated, actually, even in a 3 max where Sim variance is pretty low, is actually pretty low, right? It's not likely to happen. And the higher your Sim variance goes, right, the less likely you are to be duplicated, right? Like as you get to a something like the and 1, your chances of duplicating even yourself amongst multiple builds or other users using SaberSim goes down quite a bit. Now, as you restrict the player pool and as you play contest types where your chance of being duplicated increases, your chance of duplicating other SaberSim users also increases. So if you play NBA Showdown or NFL Showdown or MMA, right, contest types where your raw chance of being duplicated is higher, then your chance of duplicating other SaberSim users is also higher. But there's no point, and I think this is the key point about this really, is that there is no real contest type where your chance of being duplicated or your focus of avoiding duplication from other SaberSim users should outweigh your focus of just avoiding duplication in general, right? Like if you're playing NFL Showdown on Monday Night Football in a 150,000 person contest, right? There's no point in intentionally trying to avoid duplication from SaberSim users. You should be thinking about broadly about duplication in general, because at that point, your risk of being duplicated is very high. Yes, you're probably going to see some SaberSim logos that have your same lineup. You're probably going to see a ton of other logos in your contest that have the same lineup that don't have the SaberSim, that aren't SaberSim users, right? Like, yes, duplication is important in DFS, but there's avoiding duplication is not something, it's not like, here's the part of my process that I do to avoid duplicating other SaberSim users, and here's what I do to avoid duplication more broadly, right? I don't think there's any tool that is better equipped to avoid the problem of duplication than SaberSim, but it's still a problem that we kind of think about on a more broad level. So, there is nothing, I would not recommend doing anything in your particular process to intentionally differentiate yourself from other SaberSim users, because that should be handled with the sim variance. And it's just kind of doing, if you were doing a similar process to what we recommend, right? I would say like the core SaberSim process, right? Run your test build, see how things are looking. Make larger adjustments in step 1 if you want to. Make quality controlling adjustments and fine-tuning in step 3, right? That alone, combined with the randomness of getting your own individual set of sims, is probably going to differentiate you enough from the field by default. Now, there's a couple other things in this particular contest, or not this contest, in this particular question that I want to touch on because it caught my eye. So the first, this user mentioned that they're seeing more dupes in NBA than NFL. I think that makes sense, right? There's typically a smaller viable player pool in NBA than there is in NFL. There's a lot more players in the pool in NFL, especially for a main slate. Also, there are players that are much more likely in NBA to be significantly underpriced, right? There are significant value plays that open up, even multiple significant value plays that open up on an NBA slate more commonly than there are in NFL, right? Sometimes you end up in that situation where Dalvin Cook is out for the Vikings and Madison is significantly underpriced and he's 60% owned. But you rarely see slates in NFL like we saw last night in NBA, where there are 5 players on the Warriors that are 7x projected above their salary, right? And all of those players are owned over 40% or something like that, right? So as you end up with these super chalk, very high projected players in NBA, you are going to end up with lineups that have a overall higher percent chance of potentially being duplicated, or just a smaller overall pool of viable lineups for the contest, right? So that is worth noting. And then there was also a question in cash here, right? So This question says, in some cash games, I see 60% of lineups being the same. So if you aren't above that, you don't even min cash. You split it and get less return than your entry fee. And this is kind of just part of the game with cash games, right? This slate we had yesterday, right? This situation with the Warriors was not a secret to anyone, right? I wish I could say that, projecting all these Warriors starters for well above their salary was something that would be unique to SaberSim, but it wasn't, right? Everybody knew about this. Now, there was a little edge that emerged after the Warriors lineup came out because it was quite a bit different than I think what was being projected. But when on a slate where the 6 best value plays on the slate are all on one team, and there are 4 different plays projected above 7x, the optimal cash lineup or the pool of optimal cash lineups that you can build is going to be very small, and you're going to get duped a ton in cash games, right? Now, I talked about this a little bit yesterday. I would never, ever sacrifice raw fantasy points in my cash game lineup purely to avoid duplication. Because at that point, all you are doing is you are basically kind of setting up a losing coin flip for yourself where you'll lose out in the long term, right? You're saying, instead of having roughly the same chance of these two lineups cashing, I'm willingly going to take the lineup that has a 49.5% chance to cash instead of the 50% chance to cash, just so I have a slightly less chance of being duplicated in the contest, right? You are going to lose that proposition in the long term in cash games. If you are concerned about this, right? Concerned about big trains or the difficulty of kind of getting an edge or getting a very unique lineup in cash games. One, maybe consider not playing as much cash, right? It's not really in our kind of firm set of contest selection recommendations to recommend people play cash at all, right? The reason why you are seeing that there are a ton of duplicates in your 50-50s and double ups in general is because it is generally, it's too easy to be successful at cash games especially in NBA where there are, and especially at this point in the season, where there's a relatively sharp field of players of whom all have access to an optimizer that can optimize for an average, that can optimize for averages pretty well and a decent set of projections, right? One of the main reasons we still get our edge in GPPs is because optimizers don't deal with variance well, they don't deal with correlation well, and they don't deal with ownership well, and they don't late swap well, right? Or they don't late swap keeping track of those things very well. Well, in cash games, 90% of what matters is building the highest projected lineup you can. Every optimizer does that well. In fact, that's what optimizers were designed to solve. NBA is also a relatively easy sport to project, right? Because it's not an event-based sport. It's pretty easy to kind of, you can find a decent set of NBA projections, like a set of NBA projections that get you 80% of the way there pretty easily, right? So that's why you're seeing, last night when we have 5 Warriors players all together, right? Everybody played the same cash lineup. I didn't even play cash, and I could just tell you what it was. It was 4 or 5 Warriors, and probably like some combination of Giannis, Jokic, DeJounte Murray, right? Pack in all the Warriors value and throw in the highest overall projected plays around them, right? Everybody did the same thing in cash last night because it was so obviously the optimal thing to do. So if you don't like that, maybe play a little less cash. But if you're not satisfied with that answer, I would say the one other thing you can do here is play more head-to-heads, right? I believe I'm fairly confident. I know they used to do this. I don't know if they took it away, but DraftKings will refund the rake if you play a head-to-head and duplicate the player that you're playing against. So that means you can enter a ton of head-to-heads and basically just get refunded on all of the lineups that you duplicate with the other player, and then you'll end up playing only other players that played a unique lineup from you, right? And assuming that you're a skilled cash games player, you should theoretically be successful there, right? Like you should be, maybe or maybe not, you're able to beat the rake there, but should at least theoretically solve some of that. But anyway, the original question here, I don't think, just because of the sim variance alone that we're using, even at low sim variance levels here, is likely to solve a lot of the problems of duplication for you. If you are doing what our kind of general SaberSim process recommends and running a test build and trying to kind of add value somewhere to the process, the way you do that is going to be so unique compared to other players that it's even going to make that less of an issue. And the last point on this is that the broader the problem of duplication in DFS is far bigger than just trying to avoid duplication with other SaberSim users. You should be in the sports and contest types and slates where duplication does play a role. You should be thinking about avoiding duplication at large, not just avoiding being duped amongst other SaberSim users. So, but I did see there were some follow-up questions about this from Adam. He said, hey, Jordan, I've actually been experiencing duplication issues in the last few NBA slates on Yahoo, maybe because the contest size is small for 150 max and default variance is low. I was very surprised by this, and it wasn't sure if it was a question for office hours or actually for support. Well, it's definitely not a support question, right? It's a bit hard to demonstrate because no CSVs on Yahoo, but I can send screenshots. I'm duping multiple times with the same usernames. Yeah, I mean, that can happen, right? I mean, in the event that you are duplicating with even another SaberSim users, but even another just DFS player in general, right? That's unfortunately not a bug, right? That's kind of part of, I guess, part of the game here. I would say on Yahoo, there's probably a couple things that are at play here. The first is that we have had some of these slates last night where it is just overwhelmingly so optimal to play these extremely well-projected players, right? All these Warriors players, that there's like one lineup construction that kind of everybody gets filtered down, right? Now there is a little bit of like there's a question from a duplication standpoint of, is this worth it, right? The builder is going to tell you that even at spectacularly high ownership, right, and even very high variance, you're probably still going to play a ton of these guys, right? There is a question of, I think it's a fair question if you're playing, maybe smaller fields on a slate like this for NBA, is it worth thinking about the problem of duplication, right? I almost never, for most NBA main slates, I'm rarely actually thinking about actively avoiding duplication. But if there's ever a slate to do it, it's probably one where the value plays are just so spectacularly well valued that everybody's going to get shuffled down the same route, and that maybe there's a reason to kind of avoid it, to intentionally try to get away from it. If you were interested in intentionally trying to get away from it, one of, I think, the best ways to do it would be to crank your variance setting up, right? Look at a wider range of outcomes and see if you could try to diversify a little bit more, right? But on sites where on slates where your sim variance slider is going to be a little bit lower, and on slates where there are players that are spectacularly well valued, right, your raw chance of being duplicated is going to go up. And again, that is amongst the broader DFS. That is against the all of the lineups that are in your contest, not just the other lineups entered by other SaberSim users. So, but you can see, I mean, even here, right? Like, so we cranked we cranked smart diversity up all the way to 10 in this case, or sim variance up all the way to 10, right? This is going to diversify you quite a bit. So I would say if you are interested in avoiding duplication on a particular slate against other SaberSim users or against the broader set of lineups that are in your contest, I think probably the easiest way to do that is to turn your sim variance up, right? The reason we have to rely on other tools and things like NFL Showdown, like capping your max salary and maybe intentionally seeking out some negative correlation or things like that, is because once your sim variance is at 10, you can't raise that slider anymore. But I think a really good way of trying to get a more unique lineup for a sport or a slate type where you don't already have sim variance 10 is to turn it up, not necessarily to 10, but to turn it up. Now, remember, what you are sacrificing there is you are playing with lineups that are theoretically much more variant than maybe is optimal, or what we have found to be optimal based on our back testing. That is the trade-off. You are getting theoretically a lower chance of duplication, but you are increasing the volatility of your lineups overall. So you have to kind of have some sense of, how can I determine if this is a slate where it is worth increasing the volatility, increasing the variance of my results in an effort to avoid duplication. So, and I think the best advice I would have for that overall would be to look and see, is there a clear path? Is there an obvious strategy that a lot of players are going to go to on this particular slate? I don't know if we have that so much for tonight. Maybe we do. Let's see. I mean, I don't think we have that as much, right? I don't think we have the same situation on tonight's slate like we had last night. And we'll see. Maybe news will break and we will. But let's see. Adam said, right, this is happening quite often, more than just last night. I had never thought about avoiding dupes before, but I'm having to rethink that. 2 days ago was DeLon Wright and a 7% owned Justin Holiday that you guys projected a lot better than the rest of the industry. Almost all of my lineups duped that night, which was sort of crazy, but eye-opening from a process standpoint and actually thinking about edge. Anyone that played the main Yahoo last night, just take a look at the top 10 of the results and see how much duplication there was and what edge you can find there. There are dupes, trains, etc. Yeah, and I mean, again, on these, I think it's going to be very slate and contest dependent, right? I mean, the other side of this too is that, you know, on higher stakes contests or contests that are otherwise going to play sharper, right? Contests where sharper players have a greater low effective entrance contests, essentially, right? Those contests also, you may have a greater % chance of being duplicated because the sharps are going to recognize optimal lineup constructions very easily, right? This is essentially what Max was talking about in his most recent, when he came on with me 5 days ago on Office Hours, right? He said one of the main ways that he gets an edge at when he's playing like high stakes single entry is identifying the optimal lineup construction and pivoting slightly from that, right? Not the chalky players. What is the optimal construction, right? Where is the value? What is that going to lead with the way people are going? What is that going to lead to the way people are going to build lineups based on the remaining salary and positions available, right? That essentially kind of helps get you there as well. So, but anyway, I mean, again, I think the fundamental point, the point that I really want to stress here is that I think you are shrinking the problem and thinking about too narrow of a focus if you are overly focused on trying to avoid duplication with other SaberSim users, right? If it is a slate where you feel like you need to do that, it is probably a slate where you should be thinking about duplication at large, because the tools that we have within SaberSim already are going to avoid your raw probability of being duplicated amongst other SaberSim users enough, unless it's a slate where getting duplicated is just a bigger problem in general, right? We can just see that. I mean, you can just run repeated builds and see how often you actually duplicate yourself. And that is with doing no changes, right? I think most SaberSim users probably do something to differentiate themselves from the pack on a given slate. So, but if you want to avoid duplication, right, I think probably the easiest way to try to avoid dupes is to crank up this sim variance slider, take into account a more wide range of outcomes on each individual lineup, right? But recognize the fact that also increases your volatility. That increases the diversity of your lineups too. So if you are doing this, there should be some actionable trade-off you are getting on the other side. If you just crank this up every single time to 10 or 8 or 9 or 10 on a slate where you had a very low chance of being duplicated anyway, you are, you're kind of shooting yourself in the foot a little bit. You're taking on additional risk that you didn't need to. So anyway, I stayed on this question long enough. Let's move on here. I'm going to jump real quickly to a couple questions in the YouTube chat here. So, Scienter said, if I were to enter X identical single entry NBA DFS lineups on DK, would it be more effective to generate X separate simulations of one lineup or one simulation of X lineups? If you are playing, okay, I think I understand what you're saying, right? You're playing you're entering 5 single entry contests, and does it make more sense to run 5 builds or 1 build for 5 lineups? I think it generally makes more sense to just do something like this. 1 build for the number of lineups that you want, assuming that you want these to actually be unique. I'm assuming that you want unique lineups here. But if you do, it's better to do it this way, right? First of all, calling back to the question we had before, because there is not necessarily a guarantee that you won't create a duplicate lineup if you're doing it in multiple builds, right? That can still happen. But also because when you run this build, then you'll get to see everything all next to each other. You don't need to bounce between builds unnecessarily. You get to see, you can pick and choose each individual lineup. You can edit exposures if you want to the set of 5 lineups overall. It's far easier, I would say in general, especially if they're the same kind of, as you've said, identical. If they're identical contests, it just makes more sense to build everything in the in one build, manage it from there. So. Angel says, what is your best advice for golf tournaments? When it comes to golf, what adjustments should I make? I've actually done a long video about this. I would start here. So we actually have two. I think both of these are valuable videos. Learn the Secrets of Daily Fantasy Golf is the name of the playlist on our YouTube channel. Max and I did an hour-long video last year around the U.S. Open and talked about golf strategy. And then there's an older video, still a lot of the principles here ring true. 20 minutes long from a year ago. 7 secrets of daily fantasy golf. So I'd start there. I'd check those out. And if you have any specific questions about that, let me know. But I think these combined kind of detail like Max and my full strategy here with golf. I think a couple things. I'll just like fire off a couple quick hits with golf. First of all, it is a sport where it is frankly a sport where I think it's harder to get an edge. There's very little correlation. At best, there's sometimes a little bit of weather-based correlation with tee times. And because Vegas lines are pretty sharp, salary setting is pretty sharp, which makes ownership then relatively sharp, right? And it just can be kind of hard to get an edge. So, I mean, a couple things that I do is I typically, at least, so my overall strategy, I will do some player pool curation. To avoid lineup constructions that have like multiple very low projected players in them. I talk about that a little bit more in the video. And I also think anytime you can spend studying the ownership projections to tighten these up, right? Our ownership model is a computer-based model. So it's going to kind of study based on our projections and our salaries, what is the optimal way that SaberSim would play the slate. But because salaries in golf are so sharp, the players that end up, or the golfers that end up getting chalky in a given golf tournament actually end up having a lot of narrative reason for it. Either they've had really good recent form, or they have, a history with the course. Like even sometimes, golfers will get chalky because the course that they are playing on is a course that they had like a lot of, historical history on, like it's their childhood course is something you hear often. And how much you want to value that in your own individual process is up to you. But it is a fact that stuff makes golfers chalky in a way that the model's not going to pick up on, right? There's a variety of ways. Like, first of all, the name that you're hearing, if you pay attention to golf at all, like on DFS Twitter or other sources, is Maverick McNeely, right? He's going to be chalkier than 10% this week. I see his name. I literally cannot escape Maverick McNeely's name this week when talking about this week's event. So I guarantee you, I mean, I would say this is at least going to be 20. And I have a sense of that just because I see his name popping up over and over again. Right. So, the value that this is going to give you, right? If you just use SaberSim's projections and make no updates, is that you're identifying to the builder, this player is going to be chalkier more than the builder thinks, which almost certainly is going to make you more underweight and give you kind of a path to fading a chalky player. So I think those are kind of the two big things, is that I like to do a little bit of player pool curation. I also really like to kind of keep an eye on where Steam's going with ownership, make adjustments to ownership projections. And I play really aggressively with my overall ownership in golf, right? Like if I have a sense that a player is going to be, or a golfer is going to be over-owned, I take pretty aggressive stance. But start slow, invest a small amount of your bankroll. I think it's really fun. Cut sweats are really exciting. The majors for golf are great for DFS, but all things considered, I think it's a lower edge sport. So proceed with caution, I would say. But D Baker says, can you quickly go over how to force players into your lineup if the builder leaves out people you want in your pool without locking them in? So here's typically my general process for this. The first is I'm assuming you're doing this already, but the first is to do a test build and see, how things are looking, right? So we start with this, right? So we'll do this real quick. And I mean, the one thing to remember here is that the players that you see in your initial pool, right, your initial 20 lineups after you do this, are not necessarily the only players that you have access to, right? Your broader pool of 500 is likely to be much more diverse than your 20 lineups initially appear. So I always like to do this first, right? And especially if you only want to make a couple changes, right? Maybe you came in here and you said that, here's just an example, right? Maybe you think that Jokic is going to be projected quite a bit better than Embiid around the industry and that people are going to play more Jokic. So you want to make sure that you at least have, 40% Embiid, right? Well, I guess he's already in your pool, so maybe that's not a good example. But let's take somebody like Ja Morant, right? He's up to 10-5 now, right? Projections haven't really caught up. Maybe you think he's going to be under-owned. Maybe you want some Ja Morant, right? Maybe you want a lot of Ja Morant, right? So in this case, right, this kind of goes to the point of saying that, your pool size of 500 is much more flexible than I think it looks at first glance, right? So it's always good to run the test build and just see what you can get here. Let's see. Maybe I also want 60% Kyrie Irving, right? Eventually, I want to break this. Okay, so we managed to break it here, right? So here you can see the message. We need to expand the lineup pool in order to match your exposures, right? So if you ever see this message, or just in general, if you find that you're like increasing exposure to players you were getting very little of, or decreasing exposure to players that you were getting a lot of, right? I think it's a good sign to go back to step one and make some adjustments in step one. So, kind of coming back to the actual question here, how do you get players into your lineups if you're not getting a lot of them by default? I think the best way to do that after you've run a test build to kind of just see where things stand is to do this by editing projections. And I like to use 10% boosts one direction or the other, right? So I think 10% is a very it's a kind of a nice number that's not over the top, but lets things kind of stay, it leaves an impact without completely, derailing the simulations, right? So in the case of Embiid, 10% bump, maybe you take him to 60. Ja Morant, 10% bump, maybe you take him to 50. And Kyrie Irving, 10% bump, maybe you take him to 49, right? Now we go and run another build. And what we're going to see is even though we were able to get a lot of the exposure we wanted to these guys in our initial test build, we're going to have a better pool of lineups that is more representative of the angle we want to take on the slate. So again, the overall workflow, the way I like to do this is to run the test build first, just to see how things are looking, right? You may like a player that, SaberSim doesn't really like, and maybe it gives you some
pause and gives you an opportunity to kind of check your work, right? Or vice versa. Maybe you were expecting, maybe you didn't like a player that actually projects really well, and it gives you an opportunity to kind of check that, right? And you may find that in your initial build, it has more flexibility and you can get the exposures that you want without having to touch anything. But in the event that you need to, or the event that you're kind of disagreeing with the way that the builder would tackle the slate by default, I would go back to step one, make some adjustments. You see, in this case, we still didn't get a ton of exposure to these guys. So from here, now we should be able to go through and kind of get our exposure to each of these guys. And some of this, I think, is a salary problem, I guess. And this is a good thing to note, right? I mean, you can't necessarily be too far over the field on all of these high-priced guys, right? Because they're expensive. But in this case, we can. So now, we have this build where we're getting exposure to these three guys that we like. So Brad says, stupid question, but what percentage do you consider a player chalk? I don't think there's a really good answer to that, to be honest. Again, that's going to depend a lot on the individual slate, right? And sport even, but assuming we're just talking NBA, right? It depends a lot on the slate, right? I mean, I would say, a better way of looking at this would be saying maybe the top 10% of players in the field are the players that I would consider to probably the top 10% of projected owned players in the field are probably the players that I think are chalk-y, or maybe even just the top 10. Again, it depends on the slate, right? Like on a slate where there is, I don't know. I mean, on this particular slate, yeah, maybe the first 10 names you see here are like what I would consider the chalk. But there's also like a salary component of this, right? Like there are sometimes chalky players at different salary bands. Or let's do salary. Right? So like the pay up chalk, right, is like probably clearly Luka, at least at the moment, right? Even though he may not be, I mean, in this case he is.
he is kind of one of the chalkier plays. I don't know. I don't know if I would say that there's just like a line where I would say this player is chalky because his ownership is over this, right? So. All right, let's see. Chuck said, do you mind sharing if you use different sliders for NBA, DK, and FanDuel? Because I've noticed I must use different settings with some minor player edits for each to get winning lineups. I don't, in terms of, I mean, I don't think I don't. 2, 3, 6. I just use the defaults, I guess, is maybe the easier answer to this question. Like, I don't change the sliders. I really don't. I mean, I do my research builds. Yeah, so no, I mean, in this case, for the same sized contest, I would use the same sliders between DraftKings and FanDuel. Right? I mean, when I come on the stream every day and say that, like, we trust and believe in the default sliders because we've put a lot of back testing into them, that I'm not making that up, right? Like, I that's, if you want to ask, like, hey, what are the sliders that Jordan uses when he builds his default lineups? You can, they are the default values. So. Adam said, golf. You and Max had mentioned looking at make/miss cut odds to curate the low end of the player pool. Do you know where to find those at all? Seems most books. Yeah, no. So I don't actually even look at the odds. I like literally look at our percentages or others, right? I like Data Golf quite a bit too. If I was to like plug one other site, I think Data Golf and Max has talked about Data Golf in his videos too. They have a lot of free information that could be pretty useful. But no, a lot of times I am looking literally at like our percentages for how often they show up in the Sims. And again, that's not even something like, I think, wow, we just so happened to just rebuild ownership for the golf slate. I still think this is too low for McNeely, but this is something that I like. What I used to be more concerned with and have become like a little bit less concerned with, just because I think that the builder does a pretty good job of making sure your lineups are like your lineups already have the right kind of player or like lineup constructions by default. Where I think this is really valuable. So, and this is kind of getting into some of the concepts of this original video. I think the only edge that you are ultimately really going to be able to squeeze out of most golf tournaments is being aggressive with your ownership fade and your variance, right? So like when you see the default sliders for like large field GPPs, right? This is a case where sometimes I will want to turn up ownership fade up even a little bit more. And what can happen when you start turning up ownership fade is that it can push you in the direction of lineup constructions with multiple players that have a very low chance to make the cut because these players are going to be so low owned, right? It kind of pushes the builder in that direction naturally. At that point, some player pool curation to remove some of these players from your pool will force the builder to use some lower owned golfers that have a higher overall raw chance of success, right? Like my point in turning up the ownership fade slider is not so I get like 2 or 3 6K golfers. It's so that the builder uses, I'm just going to assume the ownership projections are exactly accurate, uses a 6% owned Lanto Griffin instead of a player that has a much higher projection, right? Because the projections don't matter that much. So that's kind of where that comes from. And that's kind of why I do some of that. But I've found with the default sliders lately that the lineup constructions have been making a lot of sense to me. And I've maybe done a little bit less player pool or golfer. I always say player. It seems weird when I'm talking about golfer curation. But when I do it, I use SaberSim's make cut percentages. I like to like kind of see how Data Golf is also tracking things. But Fund Your Future said, hi, just signed up. Welcome. When late swapping, how do I pick type of contest and size if there's multiple different ones? For example, I play a single entry with 300 people and 20 entries with 10,000 people. Good question. There's a little bit of a balance here, and I think it's ultimately kind of up to you how you want to handle this. But assuming you want to swap lineups separately, right? The easiest thing to do is to use these check marks. So let's say, for example, that I wanted to, just for this random set of lineups, right? I wanted to swap everything together, but I wanted to do my one single entry separately, right? You can uncheck it. So it's unchecked from your pool and then go to swap. and swap all of the other lineups at a certain set of settings, right? So then you would run this. And sometimes I've noticed the late swap tool doesn't really like to be used before lock. But you would hypothetically run this, right? And then come back here. And then do the opposite. And now swap this one. So that's literally how you would do this. Now, I will say, on a typical NBA slate, when you're coming in and you're doing late swap, you know, however many times you're going to be doing it, maybe 4 or 5 times throughout the night, all these different entries, etc., right? It is a pain and it kind of sucks. And if you're splitting these up a bunch, it takes a lot of time. I late swap almost all of my lineups together because I think it is way easier to do it that way. So I basically live with the fact that I'm going to swap maybe on lineups that are, I don't know what's going on here either. Let's see. Let me just put new entries in here. I just group everything together. So I think there's a balance there. When Max was on last week, you know, he was talking about how sometimes, you know, if he's playing the 888 contest and then also playing, you know, some smaller entry fee, 150 max kind of stuff, right? Maybe you don't want to just leave it up to pure chance and just swap your 888 with all of your other lineups or something like that. But if your entry fees are all relatively close, I typically will just swap everything together and use a set of sliders that's like roughly in the middle of the contest I'm playing. Or even better yet, what I typically will just do is just pick the contest that I kind of care the most about, or just pick the contest that's the biggest one. When I play, I'm typically more willing to accept additional ownership fade and additional variance than not. I would rather play lineups that are too leveraged or too variant than not. So I will typically just swap everything together. But if you want to break things up, if you want to do separate swaps, you can use the check boxes to do it. So. Okay, and then there was one other question from Rough 'em Up in Slack here. So let me get to this one. This is a hockey question, so we'll see how I can do here. So he said, question on hockey stacks. Seems like looking at pros, they're always stacking something like 4-3-1 or 3-3-X. When I build a Saber, when I isolate the 4-3-1, for example, why does it sometimes have a 4 stack of a team that are not on the same line or even on the same power play? For example, 2 of the 3 stack might be correlated, but the other 4 or other 2 won't be. We know correlation is so important in hockey. Is there a way to make sure the builder has all players accurately correlated when building? Thanks. Good question. So the reason why, and the reason why you in general see this, I think there's a couple things. First of all, I think we define a stack a little bit weird in hockey, to be honest. Like, I think it would make more sense for us to just say a stack in hockey is players on the same line rather than saying they're on the same team. But it's just borrowing the logic from other sports. But the reason why you're seeing that is, like, typically you're going to see that, you know, a given skater is going to have a very high correlation to the skaters on the same line, but also some minor correlations to skaters on other lines, right? Like very, very minor, but non-zero correlations to skaters on other lines. So that's why you can kind of get that where you're getting a situation where, like, a player is, you know, a player's added to the lineup. Maybe 1 or 2 other skaters are added that are on the same line, and then maybe a couple others that aren't. If you want to combat that and you want to make sure that your lineups are very perfectly kind of optimized to a particular lineup construction, I would recommend using a stacking rule. This is something that Mr. Clean got me on when he came on. We did a video a few months ago here. Mr. Clean and Couch came on and talked a little hockey DFS with me because I'm not a hockey expert, and these guys know a lot more than I do. And one of the things we talked about in that video is setting up some stacking rules to force skaters from the same line in your lineups together, right? Again, I think correlation is going to get you close, right? But if you want to be, I don't even want to necessarily say close. I think the correlation slider is going to automate a lot of this for you. But if you want to add additional value and have an expectation of, oh, what? Wait a minute.
this seems like a bug to me, and like potentially not a very good one. Not to say any bugs are good. I think our line rules got removed. So that's not good, and I will figure out what happened there. There's supposed to be a way to say at least 3 players from the same even strength, power play, etc. lines here, and I don't see them. So I will figure out what happened there. That was going to be my answer to this question. So, oh, there it is. Okay, that was really weird. I don't know what happened there. I've never seen that before. Now it's back. Huh. I don't know. Am I doing something differently? I don't know. Anyway, there's something going on here. Kind of weird. I was going to see if I can try to get those to show back up. Anyway, what I was going to say is that you can set stacking rules to force same even strength or same power play lines in your lineups, but clearly at the moment you can only do that inconsistently. So I'm going to figure out what's going on there and figure out what happened. Because I had them up a second ago and now they're gone again. So I'll figure out what's going on there. That is what I would recommend doing to solve this particular question or this particular issue in the question. But I think what we'll do is for now, we will cut the stream off there because I want to go and figure out what's going on with this. I don't see any other questions in my queue here for today. So again, a big thank you to everybody that tuned in, watched, asked questions, participated, or even just hung out here for a little while. For those of you that watch and listen to the show after it goes up on YouTube as a recording, I appreciate you as well. See you guys. Good luck in your contest tonight, whether you're playing a little hockey, a little NBA DFS, whatever it is. Good luck. And we will be right back here again tomorrow at 2 p.m. Eastern. So until then, see ya. Thanks.